Welcome to today's webinar, Deep Dive on User Sign Up and Sign In with Amazon Cognito. Our presenter today is Tim Hunt. Tim is a Senior Product Manager for Amazon Cognito. We also have Ashwin, Chetan, Pat, Peter, Rashid, and Summer, who will be engaging with you throughout the presentation while Tim presents. Tim, welcome. The floor is now yours.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. This is Tim. Thanks for joining today for the webinar. I'm really looking forward to telling you about Amazon Cognito. In particular, we've got some exciting new features that I'm looking forward to showing you. So I'm going to dive right in. We'll pause for a minute here on the topics to give you a sense of where we're headed. So we're going to start broadly talking about AWS mobile services and Amazon Cognito as an introduction. We'll quickly move on to focusing on Cognito and in particular user pools and some of those features there. I'll walk you through a demo that'll be both in the console, how you can set up Cognito, and then through an app to see how it works in action, how the user experience appears. Then we'll come back and I'll wrap up with some use cases to summarize the different ways that we see our developers using Cognito. I'll provide a slide with some resources to get started, and then we'll have some time at the end to go through some Q&A. So let's jump in, and I'm going to start with this slide that gives you an overview of a lot of the services in AWS that are relevant for mobile developers. A lot of these are also mobile or also relevant for other types of developers. There's lots of other services not on this slide, but these are a few to keep in mind. And it starts on the left. We've got Cognito, where we're going to be focusing today for identity. For server-side logic, we've got Lambda. Great way for a easy to maintain backend, way to put your logic in the cloud. We've got Pinpoint at the bottom left for analyzing user behavior and running user campaigns. And then on the right-hand side, we've got S3 for storing and sharing media and Amazon CloudFront for distributing that. For push notifications to your mobile apps, we've got Amazon SNS. And then for structured data, we've got DynamoDB and RDS, relational database services. And then once you've put all these components together in your app code and you want to test your app, we've got the device farm, which gives you a wide array of devices and OSs and carrier versions. So you can make sure that your app works well and you've got high quality for all your users across a very wide range of devices. So again, this is a sample of some of the services in AWS. There's many more. And we know there's a lot of these pieces to put together. And so that's why we've developed the mobile hub, which is really a great way to get started if you're going to develop a mobile app. The mobile hub allows you to think about what are the different solution areas you need to address, whether it's signing in a user or storing user data or adding logic in the cloud. And you can pick and choose from these cards, and the mobile hub will stitch these services together and give you sample code to paste into your app. You can even download an entire working app to see how it all works together. So it's a great way to get started. So now let's focus on identity, which is really the heart of Cognito and what we're going to focus on for the rest of this webinar. And when we think about the solutions we provide with Cognito and the mission critical aspects of identity, we divide them into these three areas. So on the left, we start with authentication. So this is the initiation point for a lot of users. It's how they sign in and how they're authenticated. That could be signing in directly with an account they create for your app, or it could be using an existing identity. That could be a corporate identity through something like SAML Federation, or it could be a social identity like Google, Facebook, or login with Amazon. So lots of different ways you want to make it easy for your users to sign in. And those are some of the authentication options we provide. Now, as soon as your user is signed in, an important thing to move on to is then authorization. So how are you going to protect your data and your backend and your operations? And how are you going to protect different users' data and separate it from one user to the next? Providing fine-grained control to access your resources on the backend. These are all areas of authorization that are going to be important to you, and we'll show you some of those solutions in that area as well. And then the third area on the right is user management. So we provide a user directory with user profiles. You can manage your users, you onboard your users, sign them up, import them, disable users, monitor their engagement. A lot of areas around user management as well. So these are the three core areas that you'll see reflected in the Cognito service. A lot of these are delivered through what we call a user pool in Cognito. And there are three main points that we emphasize here. The first is serverless authentication. What we mean by that is that you don't need to think about standing up servers or server infrastructure or fully managed service. So you can click in our console, create a user pool, and then we'll manage it for you from there. It's built on a fully managed user directory. So it's easy to set up, scales to hundreds of millions of users, again, fully managed for you. You own the users, it's your directory to control, but we make it easy for you to create it and maintain it. And then last are the enhanced security features. So a service like Cognito, which is all about identity and security best practices are really critical. So we've followed all those as we developed Cognito. And we also have features that are security oriented, like being able to verify email and phone numbers and using multi-factor authentication as built-in features. As a user directory, you get a comprehensive set of end user flows with Cognito. That includes the starting points of signing up or signing in, whether you're signing up with your email and password or username and password. We have a number of options there. We've got user profiles that users can update their, for example, their name or their email address. We've got built-in flows for things like forgetting password, resetting password. And all of this is based on tokens for authentication. So when a user signs in, they get tokens that your app can use, and we'll go through some of those details. But importantly, these are all standards-based tokens. So they can be integrated more easily into your backend or to other services. Email and phone number verification, also built-in features, and SMS multi-factor authentication, as I mentioned. And importantly, as noted at the bottom of this slide, a lot of these flows can be customized through Lambda triggers. And I summarize that here on the next slide, where we list the 8 Lambda triggers in Cognito user pools. Our intent here is to have built-in features cover the large majority of your needs. But if there's a case where you need to do something specific, maybe there's an input that you have custom logic that you want to validate when you sign up a user, for example, or maybe you want to do some dynamic message customization through a Lambda trigger. These are ways that you can really insert your own logic in important places to customize either the user experience or the flows. Now, in addition to those user flows I mentioned, you also get extensive admin capabilities, because again, this is your user directory, it's your set of users. We just make it easy to manage, but you can take all the necessary actions to create and update your pools, decide what attributes you want to include in the user profiles and which of those are required when a user signs up. You can set permissions for different apps, and we'll show you what the app settings look like in the console in a little bit. You control things like password policies, you can search for users, you can manage users, such as reset their password or confirm users. So you get all those admin capabilities as well. So now I want to start emphasizing some of the newer features that we're excited about. And these 3 areas are the ones I'm going to focus on. So the first is a built-in customizable user interface. So it makes it a lot easier now to integrate user sign in and sign up into your application. And I'll show you that in some more detail. The second one is adding federation to a user pool. So we've got built-in federation now with Facebook, login with Amazon, Google, and SAML in a user pool. And you'll see how that makes it a lot easier now to add these options for your users. And third, all these flows are based on the really important OAuth 2.0 standard, and we'll show you some of the support we've added there. So stepping through each of these now, back to the customizable user interface. We've got a hosted UI so that you don't have to build your own forms. You still can, of course. You still can create a native UI, for example, and integrate that with our SDKs. But we now have a much easier way to get started with a UI that we host for you, and you can customize to meet your style and your branding requirements. You can do that through adjusting a lot of CSS properties. I'll show you that in the console in a little bit. What I show here in the illustration is kind of everything in the kitchen sink example, just to show you some of the options. You probably wouldn't include all these options for a real live app. But to give you a sense, you can include the flow of a user for a corporate ID, starting with their corporate email address. or you can have a social sign-in with Google, Amazon, or Facebook, or users signing in directly. So all of these are options you can now very easily through the console click and set up and present to your users. And then behind those federated users is federation that's built into Cognito user pools. We now have built in these integrations so that you don't have to do things like download an SDK for Google or Facebook, or manage getting a SAML assertion from a corporate identity provider like Active Directory. You can configure these identity providers in Cognito, and Cognito will take it from there, essentially. So as you can see in the illustration, you've got an app that just is interactive with Cognito user pool, and the user pool handles all the interactions with Amazon, Facebook, Google, or SAML. It gets back authenticated user tokens and will then translate those into a local profile as illustrated by those colored ID cards, and then send back a standards user token. That CUP is Cognito user pool. That's abbreviation you'll see. It's our Cognito token that the app then receives back. So the app really interfaces the user pool. It doesn't have to understand any of these identity providers or any of these different token types. The user pool kind of abstracts that away and makes it easier to manage and assign in your users. You can also map different attributes. You'll see that if you want to bring in somebody's name or email address or even profile picture from Facebook, for example, you can do that and map it into your user profile. And then on OAuth flows. So Cognito user pools with these app integrations and federation now has OAuth 2 flows, OAuth, the authentication code flow, the implicit flow, client credentials flow as well. We also give the ability to define scopes and the ability to organize those scopes into a hierarchy of resource servers. And so you'll get to see that as we go a little bit further. Now, I've talked a lot about user pools and about federation in a user pool. I want to also describe to you a long-standing part of Cognito, which is federated identities or identity pools. It gives you a different choice here for federated users and for getting AWS credentials. And the main thing to think about for Cognito identity pools is that task of getting AWS credentials for your users so that you can access AWS resources like S3 or DynamoDB. So you can see in this illustration, you've got a mobile or web app in the first step that's going to provide a token, maybe a Facebook token or even a Cognito token. It's going to send that token to the Cognito identity pool and get back AWS credentials. Now, the app itself, in this case, is responsible for authenticating the user with Facebook or Google. So the app itself has handled getting those tokens, and it provides it to the identity pool in the first step. The identity pool provides back the AWS credentials, which are tied to an IAM role, so you can manage different permissions for different users. And then in the third step, the web app can take those AWS credentials and access a backend directly. So now I've talked about two ways that you can federate with Amazon Cognito. So let me try to describe some of the differences here. On the left, we've got user pools. And if you federate with user pools, the user pools makes it easier by handling those IDP interactions for you. It also provides a profile so you can manage those users. You can have users who, for example, sign in with Facebook, but you still want to put them in a group, still want to give them an attribute, maybe track whether or not they're a paid subscriber, et cetera. And you get the same standard-based tokens for all your users. So your app and your backend only has to know how to handle this standard set of tokens. And this is priced per monthly active user. And that's user pools. Now, if you're going to federate through identity pools, it's a bit more of a lightweight interaction. As I mentioned before, the app itself handles the interaction with the identity provider. And what identity pools does primarily is provide AWS credentials for accessing those AWS resources. Gives you ways that you can map different users to different IAM roles, to have different permissions. And this way of federating is free. You can actually use these two things together as I'll demonstrate. So to bring this together, let me walk you through a flow using the various aspects of Cognito to authenticate a user and get credentials. So I'm going to start here with a mobile app that's going to ask Cognito, or it's going to switch over to Cognito to authenticate a user. And in fact, it's already showing now the UI that Cognito has provided to authenticate the user. You can imagine the user now might click on the Google or the Facebook or even sign in directly. But for this example, say they click on Google or Facebook. In that case, the user pool is going to handle automatically those interactions with the federating identity provider, Google or Facebook in this case. So it'll redirect the user so they'll get to sign in. You'll get to see this in my demo in a few minutes. And Cognito will get back an ID token from that identity provider. It'll create a local profile and it'll provide back to the app those Cognito user pool or cup tokens. At that point, the app can use those tokens directly. You could do something like go to API Gateway in Amazon and use AWS Lambda as a serverless backend structure that we see a lot of developers using. So you can use those tokens directly. You also can use them outside of AWS. You can take them to other backend resources that handle these standard-based tokens. Or if you want to get AWS credentials, you can use the identity pool, again, with that same usable token, get those AWS credentials I show here in step 5. And then in step 6, you can go off and access those resources in AWS services directly, like DynamoDB or S3. So now let's jump over to the demo. We're going to walk through using the Amazon Cognito, and I'll show you some of the options you have and how you can set up the user pools. So the federated identities I mentioned there towards the end, you can configure over here on the right. I'm going to go over here towards the left and show you how you can set up a user pool. So if we imagine we're starting from scratch and you're going to create a new user pool, you can come up with a new name, some creative name, and then step through the settings. You've got different options you can use for how you want your users to sign up. Traditionally, you can use a username, and in addition to that, you can say if they've got an email address, they can use that as well to sign in. Or you can also simplify that and just use an email address directly without having a separate username that you have to provide. You can also define which of these built-in attributes are required for a user to sign up. Or you can create new attributes. Maybe I want to keep track of who is a paid user, for example. I can then move on to the next step where I get to change things like password strength requirements, decide whether or not users can sign themselves up or an admin must create a user. And if an admin creates a user, how long that temporary password and account will last before it expires. I've got verification options. I talked about multi-factor authentication, so I could allow users to add multi-factor authentication. That means after they've provided a username and password, they can get a code sent to their phone as an extra layer of security to make sure that we're really authenticating the right user. Built-in email, phone verification. And if you're going to use the built-in phone verification, or MFA, you also create a role here very simply so that we can send an SMS message on your behalf. There's a very simple way here of message customization. So you can do that very, very quickly. There's another way you can do it through Lambda triggers that I'll briefly touch on. If you want to manage your AWS resources through tags, you can do that with user pools as well. You have the option for devices. You can track devices, and if you want to allow users who have already signed in through a trusted device to not have to use their second factor and MFA, you have that option too. And you can create an app client. So an app client is often something like maybe for your iOS app, you have one app client, or for your Android one, or you might have for a different game or application, different app clients. You also have the ability to decide for each app client what permissions they have. Maybe they don't want to let them write to this attribute, for example. And you can define your Lambda triggers as well. So if you want to customize the flows at any step, you can do that. So those are the basic settings. I ran through those kind of quickly because what I want to do is go to some of the new features. I could create this user pool at this point. I'm going to cancel that so I don't create yet another one in my account. I'm going to show you some of the new features now once you've created a user pool. One of them is, or one of the tabs that comes up is the users and groups. So you can manage your users here. You can search for them. You can create users, import users, look at their attribute information. You can also manage groups as well, creating groups and assigning users to groups. So you've got users and groups that you can work with. And then really getting to the new features, down here under app integration, we've got a number of app client settings that are important for how you integrate the new hosted flows into your app. And so here I've got for each of my app clients the ability to choose what options I want to provide to the users. I'll show you how you configure these options in a moment, but I can decide in this case that I want to provide perhaps these 4 options for these users. Or actually, as you'll see in my, my demo coming up from Android, I've allowed just say Facebook in a user pool. There's some other settings here like callbacks to give control back to your app after you've authenticated, and some OAuth 2 controls like what flows are allowed and what scopes are required or permitted, as well as some custom scopes that you can choose as well. So if I step through, the next point here is the domain name. So you can provide a custom, you can create a custom prefix now for your domains for the hosted UI. We're going to add greater ability to customize this whole domain coming forward, so watch out for that coming forward. We've got in the console an easier way of configuring the UI customization. So this is based on the CSS. So there are lots of different properties, like on the input fields, for example, I can define background color and width and border, for example. I can do all this through CSS. And in the console, we've highlighted a number that are maybe the most important to use. You can also, through the API or CLI, that's the command line interface, you can really upload CSS and control a lot more permissions or a lot more properties as well. So lots of flexibility there, and you'll see some examples I'll show you in a little bit. We've got resource servers. This is where you can define your custom scopes. So we provide for you a hierarchy that you might have different sets of APIs. So for example, I've created one here as maybe my weather APIs, a fictitious set of APIs, Weather Tiger, I call it. And here you can have scopes like your read scope or write scope. And then you can decide which of your app clients can request these scopes. And that'll give them different permissions to access different resources on your backend. So those are all the configurations for the app integration. Now, related to that are the identity providers. And I talked about built-in integrations. So in this user pool, I've configured all of these options. I would look, for example, at the Google one. It's as simple as providing your app ID, your app secret, and defining some scopes that you want to request when a user signs up. Now, in parallel, you do an operation on the identity provider side as well. So for Google, you would go and sign up as a developer and register your app at Google, in which where you get this app ID and app secret. Similar for Facebook or login with Amazon. So you set up as a developer your app with the identity provider. You configure it here very quickly in Cognito. And then you're off ready to start authenticating your users. For SAML, you do something similar. And you create trust between your identity provider, like Active Directory through ADFS, exchanging metadata documents, for example. You can also add something like an identifier. And I'll show you how this comes in a little bit in my demo. It allows you to map users who are signing in to different identity providers. Because you could have hundreds of SAML identity providers, and you want to know which one you need to sign each user in with. In addition to that, you've got these options for mapping user attributes into the local profile, and these also then get passed through the tokens that your app receives when a user signs in. So for Facebook, for example, I've decided that the ID from Facebook is going to be put into my username. The email address I get from Facebook will come into my email attribute. First name goes into given name, last name into family name. So I can map these and others into my profile, and again, those will appear in my token, and you'll see that. So in fact, now I'm going to show you that live demo. So if I go over here, I've got Android Studio, and I'm using an emulator here to show a quick sample app. The sample app is also available in GitHub. And to walk you through the simple experience for a user, the app now has asked Cognito to sign in the user. There we go. Facebook is now going to let me sign this user in. It tells the user that the app, Tim's test app, is asking for some information, and I essentially consent to continue, and that will then switch me back to my app, and I'm now a signed in user. When you sign in a user with Cognito, you get back these identity access tokens and in some cases a refresh token. So I can now, in the app, I can take a look at these tokens. So for example, the ID token, I got back that given name, Tim, that I mentioned. I've got my family name, Hunt. I've got my email address. Now, just so you know, I've kind of hardwired a replacement here in the app, just so I don't use my real personal email address here in my demo. But I got that back as well. And in the access token, if you want to take a quick look there, these are the scopes that I required or that I requested when I asked Cognito to authenticate my user. So that's a real simple demo. And if I show you now, just here in Android Studio, let me show you quickly some of this code. Make it a little bit bigger for you. I want to show you the simple bits that you need to do just to get this working. So here I've got my main activity, and in my onCreate method, I've got another method I'm going to jump to, which is the Init Cognito. And here, if I jump down, I do just a few things to instantiate my auth object. So I define first what scopes I want to request. Those are the three you saw a moment ago, and the access token. And then I've got a builder pattern that makes it easy for me to create my auth instance. I provide things like the app client ID and that custom web domain that I showed you. I'm going to go back to the callback in a little bit, but I define the scopes, and I also the redirect UI for sign-in, so I provide control back to my app after I've authenticated. And again, I've got this callback method, which is what's called when I go through an authentication event. And just simply in this case, what I'm doing, here's my callback. On success, when I've authenticated a user, I'm going to get back a session, and I'm going to pass the session along to my UI fragment so I can pull out my tokens. And you'll see that in a second. So on success in this case is very simple, but it's how you control sort of what you do next after your user signs in. So I jump down to that fragment where I'm passing in the segment just to show you that you can easily get the tokens out as well. So here comes the session. I get out my access token, the JWT token here. Same thing for the ID token. I've got some other code not shown here where I actually populate that quick UI you saw where I can display the token. But getting access to it is really just that simple. And then the other thing I wanted to point out is once you've instantiated this auth object, signing in is as easy as calling this one method. So I call it just get session. That opens up the hosted UI and takes the user through the flow. So it's very simple. So now let me get back out of here. I'm going to show you a couple of other examples. So just to give you a flavor of some of the other things you can do with this hosted UI. So here's another one. So this would be more of a desktop view for a web app. And I've decided, I've customized it with this little Creative Commons frog I found. And options to sign in through these social providers, or you can sign in directly. Give you a sense, I could also go over and sign up. And perhaps I'm going to sign up. I can put in, maybe today I'm going to be marty@host.com. It's a fictitious email address, obviously, but say I use that to sign up. The hosted UI then is going to automatically, because I've decided in this case I want to verify the user through email, it's going to send to that email address an email that has a link that the user clicks on. And once they're done clicking on that link, they can come back here, click to continue, and then they're off. So we've got that built-in confirmation as well for your user account and for the email address. And then just as another example, I wanted to show you the flavor of the customized UI where I've narrowed it down just to what you might have for a corporate or an enterprise type use case. Where in this case, I've got a lot of different SAML identity providers. And what I first do here is ask the user to sign in with their email address. That would tell me based on that mapping that you might have noticed when I was in the console. I can use the the identifier that I've set up for each identity provider, and map the user to the right identity provider so that they each can sign in with their correct corporate identity provider. So those are some of the examples. I'm going to go back now to the slides, and we'll wrap up with a little bit of summary, and then we'll have some questions. So to summarize again, some of the use cases where we see most of our developers using Cognito, these are in the scenarios for signing in users. Top left there, I've got business to consumer, so you've got a lot of options, whether it's Amazon, Facebook, Google, or another OIDC provider, or signing in users directly. On the top right is a business-to-business use case where you can have multiple enterprise directories. In this case, what's most distinguishing is the way you authenticate, which is through SAML. You could also, if you wanted to have support for smaller companies that could sign in directly for a user pool as well. Even bigger companies where you have a few users who are trying out your app for the first time, haven't integrated their corporate directory, they can sign in directly as well. So you always have control of the options. On the bottom left, there's an employee, perhaps for an internal app that's been integrated with your corporate identity provider. And on the bottom right, a increasingly prevalent scenario is the Internet of Things, IoT scenario, where you've got now, interestingly, you've got kind of different identities. You've got a user who's often an owner, and a thing, like perhaps a smart thermostat in your home. So the user might be the owner, and then the smart thermostat. And so a lot of developers are managing the relationships between those different types of identities. And then on the authorization side, we've got a couple of scenarios that we've talked through. One is that Cognito can act as a standalone identity provider. So you may just use Cognito user pools, and maybe your backend resources someplace else. We provide those standard-based tokens that you can use any backend that can accept those standard tokens. Now in the middle is a somewhat similar approach where it's still token-based, but this is using API Gateway from Amazon, which is a really convenient service for accepting tokens and being able to build in custom logic. I'll have a little bit more about that in the following slide. And then on the right is getting AWS credentials. So you're using Cognito not only to authenticate users perhaps, but also to get AWS credentials so you can access those backend resources. And you can use a combination of these. It's not just one per app. You can use these different scenarios in a single app. And then briefly, to spend a little bit more time on API Gateway, we've got both built-in native support where you can simply configure a user pool that is any user in that user pool can access your resources. So that's easy to click in the console. Or you can do something more advanced where you can add custom logic through a custom authorizer to inspect those tokens and make more fine-grained decisions about access to your backend resources. Here's a slide on some getting started resources, and they're all coming from the developer resources page in the Cognito portion of our website. So you can navigate there from our Cognito page, or you can go to this URL directly. You'll find getting started guides, link to our documentation, videos, some presentation slides, etc. Great, so that's what I wanted to cover today. I hope that you've all found that helpful and that you'll give Cognito a try. We're going to segue now into some questions.